Hey everyone, it's Andrew again from Aurora Gameworks. Today's video will be setting up some variables that we'll need for the upcoming parts of this tutorial series, and I'll briefly go through and explain what each of these variables will be used for. If you haven't seen the first part of this tutorial series yet, we set up the ship's basic controls in that first part. There will be a card on screen now and a link in the description to that tutorial playlist. So first things first, let's go into our player blueprint that we made in the last part. Let's go to our variables here on the left, and first ones that we want to make are just some very basic ones. First one, we need a float for health, and now we want two booleans. One of them is to store the value of if we are alive or not, and the second bool is to track if we are invincible or not. We'll create some variables for our firing logic, so then we can fire projectiles from our ship. First we'll create two bools, one being enter firing yet, and another called lock firing. Let's make two floats, one called fire rate, change that to a float, and we want fire rate multiplier or multi, and one more float for firing logic. Let's call it damage multi. And once we have created a class for projectiles, we can add another variable in this section to track which kind of projectile that we are firing. And for now we will need just two more variables. Let's grab one bool and let's call it ghosting. One more float, which we will call ghosting duration. Ghosting in this context is if we have just respawned or if we have taken a hit, we want to be able to give the player a sort of grace period of where they are invincible for a short period of time. And to show that they are invincible during that short period of time, we will have the character flash very quickly. So we've made all the variables that we need to for now in our player blueprint. Make sure that you compile and save as we go along. Now we can create some variables in our Gamemode Blueprint. The first that we'll do is just some sort of gameplay, score, tracking type of stuff. First one we'll call lives. We'll get another one called score. These are integers. Let's get one float and we will call that score multi. And we also want a float for respawn time, which will determine how quickly after the player ship has died that they will spawn back in. So now these next 5 variables that I'm going to add in here have to do with spawning logic, variables that we will need to determine things like which spawn loop that we're currently in, how much of a spawn delay there is, which enemy classes that we are currently spawning in, that sort of stuff. So first we will get an integer, which we'll just call spawn loop counter. Make sure that's an integer. A float called spawn delay, and another float called spawn velocity multi. Before I go and add the next 2 variables, we need to create a struct and an enemy class, so then we can set the variable type correctly. We're going to make a struct. So to do that, right click in our little content folder, go to blueprints and click on structure, and I'm just going to call this gameplay struct. We can set the variables in there later in this video, but for now let's just go back to our Gamemode Blueprint and add in a variable for it. Let's call it current row data. Go to our variable type at the top right, type in gameplay struct, and just set it like so. Now we need to make an array variable to store all of our enemy classes. But before we do that, we need to create our parent enemy class. We want to right click in our content folder again, go to blueprint class, select character, and let's just call it enemy parent. And again, for now, we don't need to add anything into enemy parent yet. but just going back into our Gamemode Blueprint, create a variable, go up to the top right, let's type in enemy parent, highlight over it, and get a class reference. And since we want to be having all of our enemy types stored in here, let's make sure that it's an array so that we can store more than one type at a time. And let's make sure that we actually call this enemy classes. Okay, so now we just need 7 more variables in our Gamemode Blueprint, and these last 7 variables have to do with what is currently going on in our scene at the moment and getting references to and from sort of some scene components. So first thing that we'll do, create a variable, let's get it from enemy parent again, except this time we want it to be an object reference array, and we want to call it enemies just spawned. This has to do with being able to track the current enemies that we have in our scene at any moment. Next, let's create a string, just a normal variable string array, and let's call it scene, and this will we will use it to determine the current background scene and gameplay scene that we are in at any given moment. And now the remaining variables that we're going to create have to do with components that exist in the scene, like our post-processing volume, this blocking volume that we added in the last episode, and also this grid, stuff that we can change on a per scene basis if we wanted to. So first we will create a variable for grid, and let's just call it, let's make the variable type a static mesh actor to be able to change our grid material instance that we have on here. Another variable called grid dynemat for dynamic material, and set the variable type to material instance dynamic. To control our post-process from Blueprint, just create one here called post-process and set the variable type to post-process volume. To reference our blocking volume here, just variable, call it blocking vol or block vol, set the variable type to a blocking volume object reference. And the last one we'll just call direct light, which will be getting a reference to and from a light source in the scene. And of course the variable type is just directional light object reference. So now that we have all this, just make sure that we compile and save before going ahead. So you might be wondering, how do we make sure that the current value that we have in each of these component references is actually grabbing the correct component that is actually in our scene? How do these variables actually get set? So to do that, we want to go into our level blueprint, and off of our event begin play, we basically want to cast to our Gamemode Blueprint. I like casting these as a pure cast, and make sure we connect into their game mode. And basically what we can do here is that in the level blueprint, if we go into the scene and if we click on our blocking volume and we have it highlighted, if we go back into our level blueprint graph, we right click and it says create a reference to blocking volume. So then we can just pair this to our set blocking vol. Basically that's how we're going to set all of our component scene variables in the game mode. So I just skipped a little bit here as I set all this up, but you should have something that looks like this on your event begin play inside your level blueprint. Casting all of our scene component things that we want to be able to control, and we're just passing those values into the variable versions of them in our game mode. Cool, so now we can go into our enemy parent and we can start setting up some of the variables in here that we will need for our enemies. Some of them will be obvious, like health and are they alive or not, kind of similar to our normal player blueprint. Some of the other ones will be very sort of just specific to enemy logic. So the first two ones that we'll need, very simple. First one will just have another float for health, and second one will have another boolean for are they alive or not. Next we'll create two integers, first one being score give base, which will be the base value of how much score destroying this enemy will give the player. We can just copy that, and we want score give actual. I'll explain later, once we get to it, why we have one for a base and one for actual. And now, if you want a space shooter game where you want to have a separate currency, let's say, like that's separate from just the score that the player is earning, we can create a boolean called drop currency, and yeah, just set that to a boolean. And the example that I have for that in my game called Echo Rift that I'm working on is that the player is given score for destroying enemies, but some enemies that you can destroy, they will drop bits of scrap, and it's that scrap that then the player can use for actually upgrading their ship, so then they can do more like faster fire rates or change the type of ammo that they're using, that sort of thing, and that currency can be used separately from the score. Cool, so now we can move on to creating some variables that will control their enemies' movement patterns and like how they move and how quickly they'll move, etc. In the scene once they have spawned in. So let's create an integer and we'll call it move pattern. I've just shortened down to ptrn for pattern. A boolean for fade in move. A float for movement speed multiplier. And then we can have two variables here, one called x multi and the other one called y multi, because why not? And this will basically just control how much they're moving on a certain axis. So let's say that our movement pattern just has them set to move around in a sort of circular pattern. If we had our y multi set to 0 but our x multi set to 1, that circular pattern would just result in a sort of left and right movement only. But then if it was the other way around, like x multi 0 but y multi set to 1, then that left and right movement can change into just a forward and back movement without having to change our current movement pattern. And one more float for our movement stuff. Let's just call it forward velocity, which is just their basic speed value, how quickly they're coming down from the top of the screen. And now the last four variables that we'll need for our enemy parent has to do with their shooting logic. So first one that we will add is a boolean, which asks, can they shoot? And then we'll add a float, which, if they can shoot, what is their fire rate? And then we could also set a variable in here for projectile speed. So if we wanted certain enemies to be harder, we could just make the projectiles that they're firing come down faster towards us. That's one way of making them harder. And before we can make our last variable, we're going to have to create a projectile actor. So let's just go to our blueprint class, just make a new one. Actor, let's call it projectile parent. We'll add variables into there later. But what this means now is that we can go back into our enemy parent, create a variable, call it projectile actor, come to the top right, set the variable type to projectile parent, class reference. So then we can determine in here what kind of projectile this enemy will be firing at us. Cool. So make sure that you compile and save. The last major thing that we'll work on in terms of setting up variables, I know it's been a little bit of a lengthy process so far in this video, but last thing that we'll do is that we'll set the variables inside our gameplay struct. Now this is very important because we'll be using this struct stuff to be used in conjunction with data tables, and we're going to be using those data tables that we'll create in something like Excel or Google Sheets, and we're going to be using that kind of stuff to drive our gameplay logic, like what enemies do we want spawned, when and where, and what they can do, etc. So just to speed this bit up, I'm just going to have the video play a little bit faster, and you can see me set up all of these struct variables in the background. And if you need more time to see what variables I'm setting up and what I'm calling them and stuff, just feel free to pause the video whenever you need it. Okay, so once you're done setting up your gameplay struct, it'll look something like this. Sequence duration, scene, enemy count, and yeah, like these top 4 ones. These are all just single variables, but actor, locations, and so on all the way down to the bottom. The rest of these are arrays. Hey everyone, Andrew from the future butting in here. I had originally planned for doing variables, data table sheet stuff, and also spawning in enemies all in one video, but this part is already starting to get a little bit lengthy, nearing the 18-minute mark. I'm going to have the next video, part 3, be the remainder of what this video is meant to be. So next upload will be us spawning in our enemy ships, using all the code and variables that we've created so far. Anyways guys, hope you've enjoyed today's part. See you in the next one. Take care everyone.